Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon.
The times are getting difficult. I've been wondering for some time whether, as more and more people get involved in the formation of public opinion, whether it's going to be possible for large democracies to actually form viable governments, because there's too much when everybody's involved in public opinion, there's too much variation. And it's very difficult to work out a way to put together a government that is a majority government that can represent everybody. And I think that with the elections that have been going on recently, and one of which is going on today, we're beginning to see that really play out in public, that it's taken Netanyahu 2 months to form a government. And the government that he's now formed, just a matter of hours before the final deadline, doesn't really look much like a real government. That certainly doesn't seem to represent the majority of Israeli opinions. And now in England, we're very worried about just exactly what's going to come out. None of the major parties appear to be able to put together a real majority. And they all have doubts about forming a coalition with any of the other parties.
Well, this is the great peril, in my mind, of the advance of social technology. It boils down to potentially 6 billion constituencies of one. And it truly becomes unmanageable, as you suggested. Now, I worked for a number of years in a congressional office, and there are in my office there were 3 legislative assistants, and each legislative assistant had approximately 15 issues that he or she was responsible for, and the issues were broken down into essentially potential legislation, bills that would be proposed. That legislative assistant was responsible for tracking. Now, within each of those 15 issues, there were zillions of subcategories. All right, now that was 30 years ago. All right, I'm sure now, and because you can contact your congressman or senator by email instantly, and they have a drop-down list of what your issue is, and that list is extensive. I mean, everything you could think of. I mean, animal feed products, radiation of vegetables, peace in the Middle East, the Iranian nuclear deal. It goes on and on and on and on. And the thing I learned when I was in politics that way is that for each of those little issues and sub-issues, there are a couple of people who are rabid about their opinions concerning them. And those people now are somewhat indistinguishable because of Facebook and Twitter and the internet from people who have rabid concerns about actual important issues. Not that irradiation of vegetables is not an important issue. I don't know, but it's a problem because it leads to this fractiousness that makes us ungovernable. Perhaps.
Well, I find this very interesting from the point of view of the study of the way society is changing under globalization, because one of the things that I've noticed and that we've talked about before is that everyday life changes, but institutions are very difficult to change. Mm-hmm. As everyday life continues to change, which is essentially the way people interacting with each other change the way they interact with each other, because they're interacting with more and more people all the time, and so the quality of their relationships changes, and what they can rely on each other for changes, and the way they can collaborate with each other changes. But the way the society is organized, and especially the way our political systems are organized, are based on institutions that were developed starting in the 18th century, political parties. And what was so good about political parties in the 18th century was it provided a way to summarize public opinion in a limited number of ways and then have a competition for 2 opinions. Mm-hmm. But that was okay with the number of people we had in the 18th century, or even for the for American society in the 19th century. And in fact, it worked for both England and America into the 20th century because not everybody was really involved in forming the public opinion. But now, especially with everybody's having access to the internet and all the information that they want to look at, people have much more difficulty opting for one particular opinion. And so political parties are increasing in number. And it's the institutions that we've relied on for so long aren't going to work anymore. We're going to have to rethink how to institutionalize democracy. And of course, that's going to mean that democracy is going to get a bad name. But it's not democracy that's bad, it's the way it's currently institutionalized.
Well, democracy is going to change then dramatically, all right? Because what's going to occur then is we're essentially having the water come in to float all the boats. All right, which means that you do run the risk of not only many discordant opinions, you run the risk of paralysis, you run the risk of people who are fringe people, if you will, with fringe concerns, who might yell the loudest. I'm wondering if there's another metric here that we missed. I mean, back in the old days, like 700, 800, 900 AD, before people became too comfortable in life, people were concerned with existence concerns. Could you grow enough food? Did you have enough access to fresh water? Was your hut warm enough? Did you have enough firewood cut? And on and on and on. People don't have those concerns now, largely. So people are free to do what they do on social media. And one of the things we were just talking about beforehand, the current #1 trending topic on Twitter is dogs at UK polling stations. That's received 25,000 hits in the last 30 minutes. There are 25,000 people in the world who are reading about and commenting about dogs at UK polling stations. I mean, how important is that? I mean, yes, I understand that this is a good example of the collective consciousness being in touch with each other. But if those people were forced to be off doing something more productive, perhaps like gathering food, or, do you see where I'm going with this a little bit?
Yes, but human beings have always gossiped. And they used to gossip in pairs, face to face. And so you didn't know about it unless you were part of it.
Okay.
Now they gossip on the internet and on Twitter.
Okay.
So really, now, are they spending more time gossiping than they did before? I'm not sure. But I wanted to take the discussion in a slightly different direction, because I think people have always wasted time and will continue to waste time, and they do it in Congress as well. But if you look at the political system in Iran, which gets such a bad press here, and which nobody takes seriously as a democracy, but which is in fact a very democratic government, very democratic country, it has no political parties. But it has terrific representation. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason it gets a bad name in this country by people who are actually studying it carefully and not making up their minds before they look at it is that there is an attempt superimposed at the top to make sure that nothing that is decided in the government can in any way contravene Islamic law. Well, I mean, you might say that Islamic law is being used as the Iranian equivalent of the US Constitution. England works on a somewhat different principle in that it works on precedent, and the precedent can be changed at any time. Mm-hmm. But even so, you can only change the precedent to a certain degree at any time. Right. So there's something like that in any system.
There's always a supervening authority that
Yeah.
can't be. Yeah,
Uh,
I
uh,
agree with that.
but the biggest problem is to work out some sort of framework which will make it easy for people to have their say and get responses. And the committee system, which is essentially Iran essentially works in terms of a hierarchy of committees,
Hmm.
and that's a form of government that's been worked out in Islamic civilization in other situations as well. Pakistan has done it in the past. And that may be a good way to go because it doesn't require having one person to represent a particular branch of opinion for the whole country.
Hmm.
Anyway, but then of course you've got to contrast that with the most successful systems in the world at the moment, which are the Russian and the Chinese, which you could argue also are representative to some extent because Putin has a high rate of popularity. So that means presumably that he's representing a majority point of view. And the Chinese system, everybody can join the party, I think, or at least certain a very large number of people can join the party and work their way up, and it's a sort of committee system up through the party to the top government, and there's a programmed way of changing the people at the top on a regular
Hmm.
basis.
Hmm. Well, it could be argued that if you took a very long-term view of history, like you're a big history friend, um, and looked at this, you would say, well, look, I mean, take Russia for example. All right, yes, I mean Russia never had a representative government, so to speak, but when the Russian people tired of the government that they had, they overthrew it. Not once, not twice, but probably on three or four occasions, actually, going back to the Muscovy Dukes. And you could certainly say the same about China. So I suppose in one respect, putting the accelerant of increased horizontal globalized communication into the mix would only expedite the kind of wherewithal that might exist on the parts of citizens to change the government. And
Mhm.
I think what we're looking at now, and again, we were just chatting about this, is we're looking at the Israeli government that's about to be formed and the likely results from the UK election today. We're probably looking at sort of a stalemate kind of government, which is now going to be equivalent to the stalemate kind of government that exists in the United States. And I mean, how much
which is
longer
going
can?
to which is going to mean that national governments are going to move into the next phase of losing their ability to get anything done. And what does get done is going to get done by other institutions in the country. Like, for example, I've mentioned before, I think that the Indian government has failed to maintain the infrastructure of the country since independence, and now big corporations develop their own infrastructure around where they're in operation.
Right,
Uh,
right.
the problem of immigration, nobody seems to know how to control it. Everybody's worried about it from a moral and to some extent a legal point of view, but nobody quite knows what to do about it. Whether it's the Mexican border or the Mediterranean or some other part of the world. Well, the Australians having the same problem.
But this inaction, though, this inaction, which we're forecasting is going to continue and intensify, is going to act as a catalyst, in theory, to people to finally just throw up their hands and say, enough, change must happen.
What's going to be interesting is to see what comes together to generate change. It'll be some new form of organization, presumably. And I would predict, if we can predict the future, if we're allowed to do that,
Yes.
that it will be something urban. That the most, city governments don't work terribly well either, but they work. I think city governments are now working better than national governments, especially the governments of global cities. getting particularly interesting because global cities are more influential than the countries that they're a part of, and they have connections with things going on in all other global cities.
Mm-hmm.
So I suspect that it's the institutionalization of urban government that is going to gradually become more important than what's left over from the institutionalization of democratic government for nation states.
That's very interesting, actually, and it rings possibly true, all right, because for many of the reasons you enumerated. Um, I mean, we may have to bring out our Italian history from the 13th century and see how the Italian city-states fared. Um, but
It's interesting that banks were very important in that process, and
well,
they're
very
probably
much so, very much
important in
so.
this one as well.
And that was the birth of modern reinsurance.
Yeah,
The Greeks had come up with it 1,500 years earlier, but it really came into the fore in the 14th century.
yeah. But
Very
all this
interesting.
is happening while at the same time we're gradually coming into greater and greater need for supranational organization.
Hmm.
And
Simply to cooperate with each other to make sure we don't destroy the planet.
but I think that I mean civilization, the historical development of civilization has never been very well studied, I don't think. And in my opinion, it developed in the arid zone of the northern hemisphere, and it developed as trade networks between major cities.
Hmm.
And I think that the next stage of global society is likely to develop in the same way as on through the network of trading between global cities.
Hmm. You know,
Uh,
I read as carefully as I could the book that you edited, and I was always looking for somebody to tip their hand as to what they thought about the future. But I noticed it was very scholastically rigorous, that they kept away from that for the most part. So that was very interesting to hear you say what you just said.
well, it's really an elaboration of something I wrote somewhere else in a monograph that's published on a German website called Investment and Translocality,
Okay.
which I'm sure Google would find. But the point is that it we tend to think that civilization began because of domestication, which made it possible for people to live together in larger numbers because we increased the carrying capacity. But the funny thing is that it began in the arid zone, which is, if you come from Mars, the last part of the world that you would expect agriculture to begin in.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then cities began because the people ran out of food again, and so they had to move down to the rivers that ran through the arid zone, in most cases from south to north, and develop irrigation engineering, and that made it possible for more people to live together, and many more people than were necessary to actually produce the food. And so they started developing things to trade, and they looked for other people to trade with.
All right.
And
Off we
so
go.
now the
Yeah.
cities are all in the arid zone.
Yeah. That's
Uh,
very interesting. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that next week if we could.
okay,
All right, Professor. Thank you very much. Have a good week.
see you next week.
All right. Bye.